The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 34 and 53 through 56. I will be reading this morning from the Message translation. The apostles then rendezvoused with Jesus and reported on all that they had done and taught. And Jesus said, "Come off by yourselves, let's take a break and get a little rest." For there was constant coming and going. They didn't even have time to eat. So they got in the boat and went off to a remote place by themselves. Someone saw them going, and the word got around. From the surrounding towns, people went out on foot, running, and got there ahead of them. When Jesus arrived, he saw this huge crowd, and at the sight of them, his heart broke. Like sheep with no shepherd they were. He went right to work teaching them. They beached the boat at Gennesaret and tied up at the landing. As soon as they got out of the boat, word got around fast. People ran this way and that, bringing their sick on stretchers to where they heard he was. Wherever he went, village or town or country crossroad, they brought their sick to the marketplace and begged him to let them touch even the edge of his coat. That's all. And whoever touched him became well. This is God's good word for God's good people.
Thanks be to God.
So, as I was trying to figure out what I really wanted to preach about, because this week all the texts were actually good, and they could have been a sermon all by themselves. In some cases, even just a couple verses from each of our lessons could have been a sermon. So I'm glad that Vicar Heather took Psalm 23, because I didn't even want to tackle that, because I could have gone step by step through each one of those verses and kept us out here way too long. So I focused on our gospel this morning and also on Ephesians, because they were very much in line this week. But before I start, I want to tell you that the title of my sermon is Songs in the Key of Life. How many of you know where that title comes from? Okay, I see 3 back there. That's it? Okay, let me look over here. Okay, because I'm like, this is like one of the greatest of all time in our history for music. And who is the person that I am talking about? Who wrote those songs?
Stevie Wonder.
That's right, Stevie Wonder. And don't even ask me, because it wasn't like I heard a song in particular, but when I started reading the text this week and was sort of ruminating what I wanted to preach about and whatnot, and how much this text speaks to where we are really right now, I was like, it came to mind, and I remembered his song, I Wish. And I played that song, and then I actually still have the actual double album with, the wonderful cover and the little booklet inside, all of that. But I want you all, before I start, just to think about how prophetic he was, because some of the songs, the titles of his songs, were about Nixon and what was going on during that time in the late 70s, but it also was a nod to the systemic racism that was going on and acknowledging some of the leaders, particularly in his field, meaning music, that had not gotten their due as far as he was concerned by society in the way that it should have happened, and just other things that we ought to be thinking about. And I'm not going to read all of them right now, but I want you to just think about a few of these. Village Ghetto Land, Contusion, Knocks Me Off My Feet, Ordinary Pain, Black Man, Mi Acuarela es una historia, As, Saturn, All Day Sucker. Some of those you all know very well. Some of them you may be like, I'm trying to remember. And then one was also that I thought about, Pastime Paradise. Because given where we've been in the last 18 to 24 months, we might be thinking about when we were last in paradise, having had so much havoc around us in our own personal lives, our church lives, and certainly in our city and our world. And so we hear the familiar story in our text today. I'm not going to focus on the front part of feeding the 5,000 plus, but let's jump to the concluding part of our reading for today in the gospel. And I'm just going to recap just to make sure we're all on the same page. Jesus and the disciples have landed on the shore and on their way to whatever the next day will bring them, but hopefully they're hoping to get a little bit of shut-eye, a little bit of chill time. And however, we heard that the crowd notices that they had gone, and they start to look for them and actually get there before they do. But what's really interesting is what they do when they find Jesus. They don't simply show up and then sit around waiting for him to start teaching again. Instead, we are told that everywhere that Jesus and his disciples went, the crowds would go back to their homes and find all of the folks who were vulnerable and sick and bring them to Jesus. Whatever failure of long-term commitment the crowds have, at that particular moment, they realize that in Jesus, healing and wholeness were all that mattered, and that's what was occurring. And unlike the disciples, the crowds are the ones who actually get it. And they have latched on to whatever is happening through Jesus. They don't need to hear, and have explained, 5 and 4 different ways and have all the stories told. They have already said, I have seen, I have heard, and I believe. And not only that, they don't believe just for themselves. They don't just keep it for themselves. They're not sort of doing it the U.S. American way, like it's just about me and just for me. They decide to be more like a lot of the rest of the world, and they decide that they need to share it with anyone possible that needs to hear it and needs to see him. And anytime Jesus is around, the crowd always goes back home to make sure that those who can't get to him, that they will bring them to Jesus. It's hard to even get folks to go and pick somebody up for a ride. Now, can you imagine back during that time that it took a whole lot to go and get somebody, because you were probably walking and carrying them on a stretcher like we see in the Army or Marine movies. And I know Marines can hump it, but most of us aren't trying to hump it with folks on our backs or on stretchers even. We're sort of like, can't you just come on? If we can't throw you in a wagon if we wanted to, and then still pull you, and we probably would pull you and then complain all the way about how tired we are because we had to pull you over here because you couldn't come for yourself. We would have something to say. And we would make it like we were doing you the biggest favor in the world rather than sharing the greatest gift in the world. And so I just think it's interesting that when we think about where we are right now, when we think about people who choose to vaccinate or not, who choose to wear masks or not, how that shows up about, that's not even that hard. And most of us in this world, particularly in a U.S. context, so many still don't want to do it, either or. Just too much to ask. But we aren't thinking then like Christians. And specifically, I'm going to talk about Christians right now because we already know the rules. We know what we're supposed to do. But somehow our own personal freedom of what we choose to do, if it doesn't line up with what Jesus has taught us to do, then for that moment, I don't know, are we not Christians? Or are we just being sinful and don't want to admit it? But I still believe, in spite of all of that, that Christ's vision for us and for the church will evolve and continue to change. But I do believe it's still all about hope, and we carry that hope. But it's not simply about doing what we've always done. It's not about whether the technology works or doesn't work. It's not about if we show up on Sunday or not, although that's really wonderful when you do. But it's really about, are we being transformed in our minds and in our hearts? And not othering other people. As we just heard in the intro about July being Disability Awareness Month, we realized that for a lot of us, we didn't even know that it was And that we have to keep saying it because people are like, oh, yeah. But then what does disability mean? And we heard that it just means that people may be differently able. They may be different than what we consider to be normative. But you remember that God made them too. So if God made them the way that they are, then they're just fine. They're perfect. And we need to stop making them different from us because we at times are the them as well. And so when we think about what Christ wants for us, and that we always share what at the end of each service? Peace. Being the peace of Christ. That's about transforming. That's about being the body of Jesus Christ on earth. So like you and me, church is a work in progress. It is always evolving. And thankful for that. That it is always evolving. As hard as it is to drag people sometimes to where we are and where Jesus would hope for us to get. But I know that as a Black Christian, I've often had to wonder how the Bible speaks to my experience and to my concerns, both for my ancestors as well as for myself and people like me today. Just as I know my sisters and brothers and other siblings who are in white bodies also have to get better at hearing and conveying the ways in which Scripture speaks to people whose experience and perspectives differ from the way Christianity has been passed down, that always hasn't been inclusive, even of all white people, let alone other people. And so that's the part that we really need to think about when we talk about being transformed as Christians. And of course, Paul, our wonderful, if we could have a patron saint as Lutherans, it would be Paul. And Paul tells the Ephesians and tells us today that Christ is being above every principality and power. He says this before we get to chapter 2. And he's talking first and foremost about spiritual beings. And in Paul's thought process, the spiritual beings, the rulers of the forces of the air, influence human governments. He says that the world apart from Christ is under the influence of negative spiritual powers. Well, it got me to thinking about that. And there's a particular Black theologian named Esau McCaulley who says reading while Black, it's an African-American biblical interpretation as an exercise in hope. And he poses the question, which is very much in line with Paul to the Ephesians. And it is, would these negative spiritual powers have a vested interest in stirring up vitriol and hatred among the people? I think we already know the answer to that. It's an unequivocal yes, because otherwise we wouldn't be where we are in the world, or certainly not in our U.S. context. And so when we think about that, we have to say that if you believe that the Word of God, as it's being spoken in Ephesians, talks about spiritual powers, and that they influence the government and the economic systems that we find ourselves in, then we have to understand the possibility that those systems could be arrayed against the most vulnerable and the most weak in our society and communities. And so if that is indeed the case, and then we always say there's the preferential option for the poor, we have to ask ourselves, if we're Christians and we're constantly being transformed, what kind of spiritual powers are transforming us, and for what purpose? I'm not going to answer that for you today. I'm just going to leave it hanging out there, because I think that's one we need to ponder. And now I'm going to jump to the closing part of the reading. And it says that they brought the sick and laid them out in the marketplace. I can't help but think that such activity would be quite a disruption to the daily life of the marketplace. Think about just our farmers markets. We have Fondy Market here. We have our West Allis Market, and I know there's a number of other ones, but I bring up those two because those are two of the oldest and most popular that we have in the city. Now just think about for a moment, if Jesus were to show up there preaching and healing, and you got your little basket like folks come to the pantry, you got your wagon, and all of a sudden you can't get through those aisles are narrow as it is between just people. Then you got your gear. And now folks show up on stretchers. And they show up bringing people who can't move. People who may not know necessarily what we have decided are the rules of society and the way that we encounter one another and act in a space like this. How many of you all would be upset that you couldn't get to your favorite tomato stand or your favorite greens place or your favorite egg roll by, I forget that guy's name that makes all those funky fresh egg rolls. What if you couldn't get to all of that because stuff was in your way? People were in your way. But they were there for the word. They were there to be able to be transformed. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is a disruption in our daily life not seen as an interruption, perhaps as Jesus speaking to us, asking us to see the other, to make them one of us rather than being other? Why is it that we don't have time to slow down? Why is it that we're always so in a rush, even when we're supposed to be hanging out, enjoying the view and the people and all that the farmers markets or any place else has to offer? What if Jesus showed up at Deer District? Can you even begin to imagine what upset would occur if people could not make their way to their particular stalls, their particular jump place, to the Cream City New Beer place, all the little other restaurants, or you're just blocking their view from being able to fear the deer? I bet you the new motto would be fear the people. And y'all need to get these people out of here. And the sad thing is that I don't think it would take too long. We wouldn't have to really worry about it for too long, would we? Because security and the police would be showing up, right? To escort or to figure out how to get these folks out the way. Because that is not the proper purpose of the Deer District. But as Jesus would say, if we have fidelity to one true God, and that we see the face of his son, Christ, in the face of one another, is that not the perfect place for God to show up? In the masses where we're all feeling good because the Bucks are the team. Milwaukee is not some terrible city that you can't talk about because you've never even been here. But aside from that, Milwaukee has always been great in the summer. We struggle like anybody else other times during the year, but summers have always been our thing. But beyond that, now we got a championship team again since the time that, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was a part of all of the other folks in 1971. Okay, I was a baby, don't remember, but I've heard about it all my life. And here we are again. The Bucks. And even the Brewers are doing pretty good. Milwaukee has got it going on, right?
Yeah, we're stepping up.
Yeah, we're stepping up. But are we stepping up for our people? Are we stepping up for the people who might get evicted before we win the championship? Are we stepping up for the people who still can't get out of their homes and might be even more lonely? Are we stepping up for those who are never seen because they're not worth seeing? Are we stepping up for those who suffer from mental health issues and we've just decided that we're just too busy cheering on the Bucks and the Brewers and anything else that's going on that we can't cheer for peace of mind for our siblings in Christ? You see, if we truly are Christians and we truly are the witness to the coming of Jesus' kingdom here on earth, then part of our rallying cry isn't just fear the deer, but it ought to be about pushing back the systems over oppression and lifting up those that are unseen and those who are marginalized, those who are outcast, those that are on the margin. And I know that this is true because even as a person who is clergy in one of the widest denominations in the world, as a clergy person of color who is proximate to all these evangelical spaces, since the time I was in seminary, and I'm just speaking specifically on this path, to where I am now as a clergy of a wonderful congregation, as a co-dean for our conference in the Greater Milwaukee Synod, there are many times that I am still called everything but a child of God. And that, I know, is just part of the work. It's part of the demographic. It's part of the ethos. It's part of the fabric of who we are as well. But I know that there's another side. And so that is how I carry all of these things in me and still not get torn completely apart, that I can't show up for y'all, show up for my family, or show up and just say, Jesus, I'm still in it with you. And I would surmise that that's the same for everybody sitting out here, that you have a story, that you have a song that you're constantly trying to sing, and folks are just constantly interrupting and playing the wrong notes and trying to interrupt your song. But because we are God's people, we know that the divisions that are a part of our everyday world here are a part of the fabric of who we are. Our denominational squabbling is an everyday thing. We know that race is high and hard, and that we've got a long way to go. And I think it's funny that we talk about in our text today about Jesus being the cornerstone, about how things can be brought down and they can be reconstructed. I think about, we talk about today, I talked about a lot of physical walls and also political and other kinds of walls that we construct for one another. But isn't it ironic that folks are so worried about us getting back to building a physical wall to keep people out of our country for an imaginary line that exists? Isn't that interesting? And what's so crazy about it is that they clearly don't even know what they're talking about, because nobody's going to try and climb the wall, because that's not how they get in anyway. They can build the wall to represent our physical divisions yet again, and they'll just go underneath the tunnels as usual and get in the country. But that's a whole nother thing. But I point that out to just say that our individualism about this is our country, this is our border, that is so ingrained about what we think is ours, and we've still not learned the lesson from our Native American siblings that the land has never belonged to us. It has always belonged to God, and we were privileged enough to be born here, to be able to partake in all the things that it has to offer. But yet, founded by immigrants, founded on forced captive labor, we still don't want to invite others in. Isn't that interesting? But the one thing we do know, because Jesus spoke about it in Ephesians today, and he reprimanded folks for it, and that was that it grieves Jesus' heart deeply, that we keep crucifying him over and over and over again by the othering that we do of God's people, our siblings. So if we're truly going to be reconciled to God, it's not an option to refuse to be reconciled to others. It's just not even on the table. And that's why Paul is going off in Ephesians, talking about, you may have been circumcised, you may have been uncircumcised, but Jesus came to make us all one. So get over yourselves. Get it together. We're starting over again. The slate has been wiped clean, and now you got to get down to work. And so we see even back then folks were being sinful. We know folks today are being sinful. And when we look around, we see it everywhere. We see it for BIPOC people. We see it for disabled people. We see it for the LGBTQIA folks, immigrants, and even our elderly. We don't respect and revere our elderly. We see them as easy targets or people to be shut away and forgotten. Of course, not y'all that I'm looking out right here, because I know Miss Sally isn't forgotten. I know she's loved. I know Mr. Munger, you're loved. I know that we have people in our midst that we take care of. But we know, because there's a huge industry around warehousing people, that that's what we do to our elderly. And lots of people don't go and visit them. They don't go and love on them. They just waste away until they're gone. And that's sinful. But there's still hope. There's hope because we know better. And God keeps giving us another chance to get it right. The thing is that we have to get out of our own way and stop being afraid that someone's going to take what we've got, that the things that we've always known are crumbling around us, or that the dreams that we've always dreamed may not come true. That may be true. We might not see everything to its fullest culmination. And we're probably getting tired. We're probably exhausted. And we probably want to take a nap or a vacation. How many people want to take a nap? Yeah, lots of people want to take a nap. How many people want to take a vacation? Okay, a whole lot of people want to take a vacation too.
Definitely.
Well, you know, Jesus rested. But the kind of rest and the kind of naps that Jesus had when he was thinking about that was after a most extraordinary week of labor. We know that that God rested on the seventh day. And so I ask you all, why do we not rest? Why is it that we toil and we talk about all the stuff that we do and how tired we are, but why do we not rest? How many of you all go on vacation and then when you come back, you say, I need another week or I need a couple of days to rest before you go back to doing whatever it is you normally do, right?
Yep.
Well, when Jesus talks about Sabbath and when God rested, that's what he was talking about. But it was not kind of rest just for your body. It was also for your spiritual soul. We still, in our American culture, have not figured out how to do this. Because we always feel like we need to be doing something. So even when we're laying there napping, a lot of times folks can't even nap right because then they jump up and say, oh my God, I've napped too long or I've done this, because now you got to do double time to do whatever you thought you were supposed to do because you decided to take a nap. Or because your body just said, I'm not doing anything else. You're going to stay here. Whether you fall asleep or not, I'm not moving. And that is not the kind of rest that we're talking about. We're talking about the kind that you feel restoration, the kind that brings you back to God, the kind that we talk about in Psalms 23, that we talk about when we say, peace be with you. That's the kind of rest we're talking about, the kind that will bring you back so that then you can empty out again. Most of us are just constantly running on empty. And so then you're being sinful to yourself as well as to God, because he gave you a day to rest. And your mothering spirit and the Holy Spirit is nudging you, telling you to sit your butt down and rest. Stop doing something. Put the computer down. Put the phone down and just rest. Maybe your rest means communing with your family. Maybe it means hanging out and just, having Cops burgers and shakes and ice cream and just hanging out with folks. Maybe it means a nice barbecue, with homemade mac and cheese or whatever. I don't know who made it, but I didn't this time. And we're just going to sit down and relax and eat and enjoy each other's company. What are your gathering spots? Where are the places where you share the good news? Where is the places that you renew your friendships? Remember, marketplaces weren't just a place of healing, but they were always a place of connection. Both in those times and in our times, Jesus wants us to be more inclusive and to find ways to connect in body, mind, and spirit, and to be a welcoming presence wherever we find ourselves. And we're to be transformed. We're transformed easily when we go to the Deer District because we get all hyped up, right? And it's easy. But what about when we come to church? What about when we go home? What about when we visit folks that can't make it out? That's where we need to see God's bounty displayed and his power. That's where the healing of someone's spirit comes. This isn't simply a removal of what ails them for a moment, but it's about restoring who they are and seeing them as God's full person in abundance. The place that we need to remember is that we carry the marketplace with us. A place where we live, a place where we love, and a place where we laugh. And it is part of God's good bounty that we share that with our siblings. How might our world look and our lives feel if we followed more of the example of the crowd in caring for one another than the disciples who only often thought about themselves? What if we lived our lives in the belief that God has provided enough for everybody, and we needed to make sure that it was available for all? That if we really believed in the marketplaces, we would know that it was more about how we connect with each other rather than what we could buy or sell. And then what would the bounty in this world look like if we operated on that principle? I know that our stories are different. Our stories are our own. But parts of our lives touch one another because they are like the keys on a piano that are played. And the song that is made, the tune that we hear is not our own. It then becomes someone else's because it touches their heart, it touches them. And those soulful songs are the keys in the songs of our collective lives. May that be your joy. May that be your peace. And may you remember that you are the marketplace to share that abundance. Amen.